guys, Mike with the Outer Circle, and I've stayed up extra late putting this together for you. So, what is this madness? Well, this is essentially the timeline from 3rd edition through to 8th. I picked from 3rd edition because this is where the rules, as people who played in 7th would understand, basically began. They are quite different to 2nd edition 40k, so it makes the really logical leaping off point for everything that came after. And as you can see, it's a bit of a busy list, but that's all right because we're going to zoom right in on this and break it down section by section. So let's go down to 3rd edition. 3rd edition is the prime timeline, but what changes were added along the way? Well, first we got USRs. So universal special rules are introduced, the idea being that if you have a recurring special rule that pops up on unit after unit in the game, why put it in the unit entry? Just put it in the main rulebook, and then you're done. And any similar sort of rules that are out there, you could call it Feel No Pain, you could call it Damage Mitigation, you can call it whatever you like, but if they have functionally the same role, combine them all together, call them the same thing, slap them in the basic rulebook, and you're done. Unfortunately, USRs did get very bloated over time, but in the original sort of book, there's only about 24 of them. And that was including every little possible combination. In fact, I think in the 3.5 Codex, which was a 3rd edition book, designed and written for 4th edition, I think it was only about 12. We also had, stemming off of the USRs, bulk power / special weapons. Now, this got a special mention for the special weapons because it really changed things up. You started seeing things like massed incubi, for example, where basically from 3rd edition onwards you would get whole units of power weapons from later in the edition. And of course, some armies had no way at all of mitigating this. And it was a trend that has stuck through to today, where instead of having units doing traditional forms of damage to one another, chainsword versus power armor type thing, instead it would be whole squads with power swords, and it became very, very powerful game mechanic. And of course, it meant that a slow creeping progression of power levels began in the game because, well, Terminators could be killed well prior to their own initiative step by things like power swords. So it meant that Terminators slowly became weaker and weaker and weaker as the editions dragged on, when you're having squads that are able to take all the same weapons as Terminators, but none of the drawbacks of Terminators. Very important thing to note. So the sort of list that we would see at the end of the edition are, so I've written down a few. These are my nicknames for them. Some of them are common nicknames you might have heard of, but Gorstar. Gorstar was a Necron list. You had 2 Necron Lords with Resorbs, a Monolith, and 4 squads of Necron Warriors. In those days, any 6 rolled to wound against a vehicle by Necron weapons was instantly a glancing hit, and glancing could destroy a vehicle in 3rd edition. So when you rapid fire 40 Gorse weapons into a Land Raider, what do you think happens to the Land Raider? Roll a single 6 after that, and kaboom. Very strong. What the Monolith could do was it could actually suck a squad out of close combat, and then they just re-emerge from the Monolith portal. So what would happen was you would get close enough to these big blobs of Necron warriors, charge them with a unit of something like Terminators, and then that squad would just be blip, teleported out of there, and then re-emerge from the Monolith, and all of a sudden your Terminators are just sitting there waiting to get particle whipped by the Monolith, which would just instant kill most of them. And of course, the twin Resorb Lords would just bring a lot of this stuff back to life. It was a very points-efficient army. Death Company Blood Angels. Death Company were essentially the first sort of, we have a bunch of special rules and we're an army-wide, basically, force. Very, very, very strong. Remember Cassidy's Death Company, just an all jump pack, all assault, all the time list. Very strong back in the day. Going hand in hand with that was Supercharger Blood Angels. So supercharging was the thing you could do on Rhinos. They got to move an extra 6 inches off the top of my head, but if you had to roll d6, and on a 1 it immobilized the Rhino because the supercharger blew. Pretty cool, pretty thematic, but what you have to understand is back in those days you could charge out of a Rhino. So what happens when you're playing, a standard 1,000-point game back in 3rd edition, and there's 4 rhinos loaded with a mixture of Death Company and Blood Angel Space Marines opposite you, and then they come screaming up the board and assault you into turn 1. Okay, that's pretty bad, but it gets worse, because what else they could do was they could actually you could consolidate from one close combat straight into an enemy unit if they were in range. This meant you were locked in close combat for the next turn, which meant you couldn't be shot at in the next turn. But if the combat hadn't been fought yet, then you got to participate in that combat, which meant you had this chain reaction of close combat that would occur from this point onwards. Very, very spicy stuff. And Siam Spam, which was the Siam Han Craft World Supplemental Codex list, which gave you a ton of jet bikes and Vipers, and it ignored basically the standard force org chart. So, yeah, that was a particularly strong list because, again, speed was very important in those days. Flat movement stats of 6 on infantry was very common. Being able to bring just all that Guardian firepower to bear, but on a bike platform, which is that bit tougher, bit more firepower. Very, very, very strong. So, anyway, all of those changes combined is what this black square is in the middle, and that leads us into the 4th edition timeline. So, if we follow the 4th edition timeline around, we get, well, let's start the very, very tip here, the green and orange. Sorry if you're colorblind, but I had to make the colors out of something. So, Force Org optional Forge World / tank armies. So that's all a 4th edition introduction. You could have whole armies that just basically ignore the Force Org chart. Now, it wasn't broken yet, although it was incredibly strong at this time. The reason it wasn't broken was because, well, there were not that many tanks in these armies at the time. We weren't seeing things like 12 demolishers yet. You'd be seeing, 3 or 4 demolishers. Still very potent, very strong. But this is also a time when guess range was still a thing. So, it's not like they were hitting all those demolishers on exactly one guy and then maximizing where they hit. Because they didn't have that kind of range or that kind of accuracy. I also wrote in highly custom armies, i.e. Chaos 3.5, because yes, it is a 4th edition book, even if it came out in 3rd, and it set the tone. All the other codexes that came out at this time were super customizable armies. You could make the most thematic armies that the game ever saw. And then partway through the edition, they decided they didn't like this approach, so they switched to no customization, which is where the next Chaos Codex dropped. Partway, well, it was actually right near the end of 4th edition, and everyone knows what I think of that. So we went from having these armies where it's like you can make exactly the Legion or Chapter or Hive Fleet, Guard Regiment, whatever it might be. You can make exactly the one that you want to no. Everyone just, whatever the cover art is, that's the army you're supposed to play. That's what we moved to. And these changes combined led to the end of 4th edition. This edition we had Fish of Fury, which is essentially taking devilfish that your troops could shoot past, the enemy couldn't shoot past, and basically using your devilfish as a wall to protect you from enemy fire. In Full Legion, that was making a whole bunch of crazy Alpha Legion Chaos Chosen and such, tooling them out with all the war gear, turning basically the entire army into miniature characters, and then infiltrating them to 18 inches away from the enemy to start the game. 12 if they couldn't see you. Very, very strong. And Tread Guard, of course, which was your all-tank Imperial Guard forces. So, we now move into the 5th edition timeline. So, as we progress up the timeline, they introduced flyers. Now, flyers were not actually flying vehicles with all these special rules yet because they were flying, that you could only hit them on snapshots and such. None of that existed in the game. So this is still core framework that's roughly the same as 3rd edition with just tweaks here and there at this point, and just experimentation with the core rules of the game. So flyers are introduced, but this brought about a lot of problems because many of them were introduced as transports and things like that, and so you could get a lot of spam of these really high-speed skimming units. So you might go up against Guard Army, for example. I think it was a 1750 point Guard Army, had 6 Valkyries and 3 Vendettas. And you'd have things like Plasma Gun armed veterans jumping out of the Valkyries. Valkyries, of course, had las cannons armament. Vendettas, triple las cannons, twin linked. You had demolition charges. So that was where a guy would jump out the back of a Valkyrie and throw a demolition charge onto your unit, which is a strength 10 AP2 large blast, which obviously deleted everything it touched. And it, cost like 10 points for the demo charge and another 8 or whatever for the guy that threw it. That's a pretty good investment when you throw it onto a 300 point squad of Terminators. And these units were fast because they introduced turbo boosts and things like that in this edition. So you had skimmers that were moving, 20 odd inches. I think the fastest were going 30 to 36 inches in a single turn. So you could never tie the things down. You had to kill them with shooting, and there was a lot of mitigation against shooting, like jinking and such, that was introduced into the game. So I have 2 different streams here for codexes, the Matt Ward codexes and the Kelly and Cruddas codexes. So this edition is sort of synonymous with the writers themselves and their contributions. Matt Ward codexes get their own line because the guy wrote incredibly consistently overpowered codexes. But if the whole system was written by him, you probably would find that you had a really balanced, fantastic system. So that's why he gets his own line, because, well, yes, it was deviation, it did lead to the death of the system in a way. On the other hand, you have Kelly and Cruddas, who had a real mixed bag. If Phil Kelly was looking after your Chaos Space Marines, you were screwed. But if he was writing your Eldar Codex, you were about to be kissed on the dick. Same with Cruddas. If he's writing your Imperial Guard Codex, yeah, you're going to get spoiled for choice. But if he's writing your Tyranids Codex, well, you get 5th edition Tyranids. So this is the problem here, in that they are very inconsistent writers. And of course, when you have a mixture of inconsistent writers, overpowered writers, well, there's not much room for stuff that's in between, and so that is really what was killing 5th edition, and exploiting that. So some of the famous lists from that time, well, anything Necron. I say anything Necron because you could pretty much build any list out of Necrons. You could do 18 Necron Wraiths, throw in a couple of Destroyer Lords, a preferred enemy. You have a whole army that's strength 6, rending attacks, multiple wounds, 3+ invulnerable saves, ignores difficult terrain, moves 12 inches, or moves 6, charges 12, whichever order it was in. They could also... they had whip coils. They reduced your initiative to 1 in close combat, no matter what, so they always struck before you, and they only had to be in base contact with your unit, not per model basis. So even guys that had power fists but were not in the front row still got affected by this. Very, very strong. You also had Necrons where they just spammed Tesla weapons. Every 6 to hit they rolled, generated 2 extra hits, and the average Tesla weapon started at strength 5, or their flyers, strength 7. They had another one where you'd have a Cryptek with a squad of essentially Deathmarks snipers. They would jump out. He had a Flamer weapon, which was it was the strength of your leadership, AP 1 or 2. Or strength 10, sorry, wounded against your leadership. But what the Deathmarks did was any squad that they marked for death, which came under fire from their unit, it was like a leadership 2. And so this became like, a strength 10 weapon against toughness 2. So it just instantly vaporized squads. You could take 3 of them for, under 1,000 points in flyers. I fell victim to that list. These are the sort of things Necrons could do. Very nasty. They had another one, the Night Shroud, was it? Or Doom Scythe, or one of their flyers. I think Doom Scythe. Could fly in and had an 18-inch long ranged beam that was a melter beam. Strength 8 AP2 or AP1, and it just fired an 18-inch line. So these are high-speed skimmers. They brought them on the board, flanked your army, and then they just fired a beam straight up through all of your stuff. You could counter it, but it was incredibly strong for the amount of points people paid for it, and adjusting to this with lists that were written prior to the existence of these units and didn't have any war gear capable of firing them was really difficult. Venom Spam, similar sort of thing. So this was the Dark Eldar when they got their 5th edition rewrite. I think that was a Phil Kelly Codex. they got Venoms, which were high speed, low armor value grab vehicles, which you could put small squads into. The problem was that the squads could fire out of them, and they took a Venom cannon, and the vehicle had a Venom cannon. And Venom cannon was very, very strong. Actually, it was Splinter Cannon with Venom rounds. Venom Cannon itself is a Tyranid thing. So they would take these high-speed units and they'd fly around flinging 8 shots into units. Doesn't sound so bad until you realise that there might be 20 of the fucking things in, 1,500-point game, or, near enough to. And they had shrouding, thanks to their night cloaking devices, whatever they were called. It's been so long since this edition, I don't remember everything, but essentially they had 2-up cover save against your returning fire. So, yeah, good luck killing them all, and good luck catching them, because they could move 30 inches a turn if they wanted to. Leaf Blower, yep, speaks for itself. That was a guard list that basically just blew you off the table. Lots of tanks, lots of high-strength weaponry. Drago Wing, of course. Keldor Drago, 10 Paladins, Librarian. In these days, you could split wounds, so you could put 1 wound onto each model before you actually remove them from play, and of course you had 4+ Feel No Pain in this edition. So on a 4+, you just ignored the wound that you took anyway, as long as it wasn't an instant death wound. Which meant that something like Drago Wing, you may cause 10, 12 wounds to the squad before they reach the front of your army, but the problem was every single model in the squad would still be alive. They're all armed with force weapons. They're rolling twin hammer hands. They're going to be striking strength 6, strength 7, with instant death on all of their weapons, and of course they're all power weapons, so you don't get a save against them, and it was very, very, very strong at the time. So yeah, Drago Wing, beautiful. Mephiston Wing, so Mephiston, tons of Blood Angels, Honor Guard, veterans, plasma weapons everywhere, Karablos Sanguinary Priests, giving auras of Feel No Pain, and the Dreadnoughts had little tickle fingers, so the Dreadnoughts, just as long as they hit you, basically they kept getting extra free to hits because of these talons that they had. So if a Dreadnought charged something like Tactical Squad, it was guaranteed that Tactical Squad was going to all die that turn. Even Leviathan Dreadnoughts in 40k, 30k never reached those levels of power. That's how strong box Dreadnoughts were in Blood Angels. And of course they could drop them out of Storm Ravens, they could drop them out of Drop Pods. It was brutal. And lastly, Biker Knobs from Mars. That's just my name for them, but after the cartoon show, Biker Mice from Mars, yeah. Biker Knobs from Mars, same thing as Drago Wing. You took a bunch of Biker Knobs, so strength 10 power claws on bikes, and just mix up the weaponry slightly on them, allocate the wounds however you liked, and all of a sudden you have a similar unit where you could spread the wounds right out, so you're still hitting every close combat with the maximum number of models. It's just they've lost all of their wounds when they hit the close combat. Really, really strong, nasty lists. So that took us to the end of 5th edition 40k, which took us into 6th edition. Now, 6th edition immediately introduced a whole bunch of new mechanics. So when it comes to something like 4th edition below, you can see Force Org optional started to happen. Forge World Tank Army being an example of that. No customization versus high customization codexes. So those are just more observations than rules changes. But here in 6, straight away we have like some key rules changes. First, there's the Allies Matrix introduced. You can now take multiple armies and combine the strengths of the two together with no thought really as to how the balance would happen. It was just meant to be, I believe, something that was very fluffy. And with things like, Sworn Brothers and Battle Brothers and things like that, the different terminology they used, you could have some very nasty combinations. We then have flyers becoming actual flyers as we sort of know them, and flying monsters creatures. So you're taking units that were already very strong as skimmers, and now you're turning them into these supersonic death machines. And the worst part of it was they didn't have anti-flyers introduced into every army, and they hadn't really thought through the repercussions of their actions. Well, because of this, unfortunately we ended up in a situation where it was like, what the hell are we able to actually do to these things? Well, basically the only thing that was available to many armies was the Aegis defense line, or a Bastion. So you could take those because they had the option to upgrade and give them the quad autocannon or the single las cannon as an anti-aircraft option, and that was it. Even the Chaos Space Marine Codex, the first one to launch in that edition, had the Helldrake, but it was a flyer that really couldn't hurt other flyers. You had to vector strike the other flyers with it, which meant actually getting to them and crossing over the top of them with your flyer. And that's not what people took Helldrakes for. So, and older codexes, ones that hadn't been updated, had just 0 anti-air. But of course, all of those late 5th edition codexes like Necrons had all these flyers built in, so they had anti-air built in. So they tended to dominate the early 6th edition scene. Hull points on vehicles. So they decided that vehicles, tanks, whatever, were too tough, despite a constantly getting more favourable vehicle damage table, because of that glut of special weapons that I mentioned start to be introduced from 3rd edition onwards. Vehicles became easier and easier to kill, but it was still felt they were too tough at the end of 5th edition, with vehicles just taking 15 glancing hits in a row and it actually just still being alive at the end of the game. And whilst that was a problem, I think there were other ways around it than what they came up with in hull points, because you would have a vehicle that took very minor damage from units that couldn't actually penetrate the armor. They'd just take 3 glances and your Predator's dead. Took 4 glances, your Land Raider is dead. And so weapons that were relatively ineffectual in the last edition, just as long as they could get that glance, didn't matter what they rolled on the table, they just caused damage. So that was a huge change to the game. And of course, the core psychic disciplines got introduced. So now we have biomancy and pyromancy and telekinesis and all of that. So that's the very core start of 6th edition, which then splits off into the Horus Heresy. Now, the sort of list that we were seeing, Serpent Spam. Oh, people would remember that one. So that was Eldar Wave Serpents, which were a transport option. So you could buy as little as, I think, 6 Eldar Dire Avengers, stick them in a Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent could fire its Serpent Shield, which is something like 60 inches, D6 plus 1 shots, ignores cover, strength 6, pinning. And it was on your basic transport unit. Yeah, it was incredibly broken. Serpent Spam, which is pinning whole armies, and it was the tournament meta for a little while. We also had Screamer Star, which was taking a hell of a bunch of Screamers of Tzeentch, Grimoire of True Names type stuff, giving them really high vulnerable saves. This really reached its peak, I'd say, in 7th edition, but it was a 6th edition list. It's just changes that came with 7th edition psychic powers that made it pretty good. Screamer Star, though, 2+ rerollable involve save. Just don't roll a 1, because once you got that 1, it was basically game over. Triptide, it's triple Riptides, and there was even a formation that you could take which gave you a unit of broadsides and an extra Riptide on top of this. So really, Tau was always an army that was supposed to be high risk, high reward type thing. Like, the risk was if the enemy got to you, they would absolutely beat the snot out of you. But if you were able to engage them in a prolonged shooting game, you were going to belt the snot out of them. The idea being, of course, that if it's just fire warriors, well, that's pretty achievable for both sides. But once it's just units of overcharging Riptides, yeah, that doesn't flow as well as logic, because a Riptide, well, it can move very fast. I saw one jump 36 inches once, I think it was. It was definitely over 24 inches that it moved. When a Tyranid army finally had crossed the table and got to it, it just used its special jump ability, because it's like a jetpacking unit, and then combined it with its overcharge ability that it had, and just went bloop, jumped across the table, and then started shooting the Tyranids in the back, and there was just nothing the Tyranid player could do about it, because you'd say it's toughness 7, many wound, monstrous creature. Good luck hurting the thing. So yeah, Triptides was pretty nasty. Then Taudar, so taking basically the worst aspects of Tau and Eldar and combining them together. Farseers casting Fortune onto Riptides, for example. So, yeah, back in those days, talking like re-rolling the hit, re-rolling the wound, re-rolling your own armor saves, those sort of abilities being cast onto your allies. And the two really, really complemented one another well, because the Eldar actually had some hitting power, some staying power, and of course the firepower of the Tau was just off the charts. So combine the two together, what do you think you got? Again, this was unplanned for interactions from the Allies matrix. Grab Smashfucker. So this is sort of a combination thing, but basically taking graviton weapons because they wounded against your armor save. I think it was at the time. So if you had a 2+ save, you got wounded on 2s, or something like that. So graviton weapons were really, really strong in that edition. Smashfucker was just making this crazy Iron Hands chapter master on a bike, who just, basically unkillable, like 3+ invulnerable save, toughness 5, builds in feel no pain, all that sort of thing. Brutal. You can go look it up. There are plenty of Smashfucker, Smash Hammer lists out there. Just Google them if you want more information. That was about the point where I started dropping out of the game. And Trip Drakes. So that was a really simple list. That was just a Chaos Space Marine player who knew he had a crap army because he played Chaos Space Marines. So he made up for it by taking 3 Helldrakes with the Bale Flamers, which, surprisingly enough, those 3 units could pretty much just kill an entire army on their own. So, as we move up the chart now, Heresy is still on its own divergent path there, and then somehow 6th edition gets some big inputs late in the game's life. It's somehow still 6th edition at this point, but we get data slates. The very first data slates get added, and this was essentially taking there would be units that would be added through things like White Dwarf mid-edition. It had always happened, but it started to really pick up in 6th edition, where it was just like, hey, here's a new unit for your faction. These days, that's commonplace to see new stuff added for Space Marines every single box set that they bring out mid-edition. Wasn't really a thing back then. It was you got all your releases when your Codex did. But data slates happened, and then they started to morph a little bit into, hey, just here's a unit that's already out, but we gave it some different rules. That was their original release. And then we had supplemental codexes, but the problem with the supplemental was they were different codex, and you could ally them to your main codex. So you'd have Iyanden Craftworld, you'd have Farsight Enclaves and Tau, whatever it might be, and yeah, it was as broken as you think it could be. And then at this point, we have the end of the editions. That's what this black box is. That's where 6th finally coalesces and ends. Just in front of it, we have the Heresy comes in, hits 7th, and then Heresy 1.5, that top line, goes off and does its own thing. But then we have all these other changes that have happened. We have formations have entered the game. Oh, goody. So now you can take units, usually with buffed rules, that you've paid very little points for, and these formations, often, funny enough, just so happened to coincidentally relied on the fact that you bought certain box sets from Games Workshop's web store as a bundle. It's just, what a coincidence that was. We also had unregulated Lords of War. So Heresy had basically a setup for Lords of War, and it said, hey, you want to take a Primarch or a Super Heavy Tank? No worries, happy for you to do it. But the restriction is that if you're going to take this unit, then it has to be no greater than 25% of your points, and you can't take them at all below 2,000 points, because they're so powerful units, they will affect the game too much. Fantastic, Mr. Alan Bly. 40k said, that's fantastic, let's ignore all of the restrictions and just say you can take the super heavies anyway. So anyway, you can imagine what happened from that point on in 40k. The crazy combinations of super heavies and knights, tanks, Guilliman when he returned, all of this sort of stuff that just crept into the game system. We also had Maelstrom of War, which was meant to be this really narrative-driven objective thing where you had a deck of cards, you would draw objectives from the cards each turn, and those are the objectives you had to complete. And as it pretty much has been since its inception, every version since is awful because there was no great discard mechanic to it, and you would often get objectives that were just impossible to complete. And if you got objectives that were impossible to complete and the other person got objectives that were very easy to complete, well then it didn't matter how good a player you were, or what your strategies were, or how bad a player the other person was, they just started kicking your butt. And of course this is very unrewarding for people. And of course, the psychic phase. So, psychic powers have been split off into different disciplines under 6, but now they got a true phase unto themselves and a whole new method of casting powers and generating power dice. So, that's a lot of changes if we zoom out in the table here in just these 2 editions alone, like core rules changes as compared with, everything that come before. 5th edition, just nothing there. Flyers is really the biggest thing. 4th edition, the changes to the Force Silk chart. 3rd edition, USRs, bulk, special, and power weapons. That's nothing compared to what came. And the sort of lists that we would see. Oh boy. Well, we had Decurions. So Decurions were taking formations to basically the end game, the end phase. So we then hit 8th edition, the Great Timeline Reset, because of this. But here are some of the armies we saw. So they're all really nasty. I don't know which end of this chart to go from. So let's just start with Free Marines at the top. You would buy this detachment from Games Workshop, and what it gave you was free transports for every squad. Now, how many squads do you think you can fit into 1750 points, standard tournament size? Quite a few. So how many free transports do you think you fit in? Probably around 800 points of free ones. Yeah, that was fair and balanced. 800 points of Las Razorbacks just added into the game won't have any impact whatsoever on the outcome. Strangely enough, had a huge impact. There's another one detachment the Marines had that I didn't list here, but you could take I think it was Skyhammer, something like that, formation. They sold you a bunch of out-of-date Assault Marines and a bunch of out-of-date Devastators, and they sold you drop pods, and they sold it as a bundle on the web store. And if you bought this bundle, all of a sudden, everything came down in turn 1. All the Devastators were in the drop pods. All the Assault Marines came down in turn 1. They could assault from Deep Strike with the Assault Marines, and the Devastators in the drop pods could move and fire when they disembarked without any penalty. That's balanced. Yeah. Decurion, Necron formation, similar sort of thing. So taking the Necrons and just bumping them up with special rules. Summon spam. So this was just bringing in a bunch of summoned units. And if you took Tzeentch Heralds, you could make it essentially infinite summoning from memory. So you could just keep summoning more and more units. Although they weren't the strongest units, the fact was you were just bringing endless models to just bog the opponent down with, hold objectives. Yeah, really nasty. Ravenwing Jink, another funny one, because Ravenwing weren't super OP. They were quite strong, but they weren't super OP until you got the Ravenwing Jink down pat, which was 2+ rerollable cover saves for the entire army. So good luck killing them when they did that. Invisibility spam, so units could be made invisible by Psykers. There are ways of doing this with multiple Psykers, whether it was taking multiple Farseers, Seer Councils, whatever it might be. And you would cast invisibility on a unit like a Wraith Knight or a Riptide, and these units would then, all attacks against them count as either Weapon Skill, Bliss Skill 1 or 2. So you just could never hit them, and they got like invulnerable save from it and all sorts of things. Flying Circus, so this was most commonly performed by essentially it was your monstrous creatures, demons, and also by the Tyranids. So Tyranids, 2 Hive Tyrants, and then a bunch of Hive Harpies. So you have all these flying monstrous creatures, arm them up with like Twin Devourers, and just have fun. Because nothing could hit you because there wasn't enough anti-air in the game. And the list that really got the anti-air was you had Hydra with Guard, Hydra tanks, and you had Hunters/Stalkers with Space Marines. And that was about the extent of ground-based anti-air, apart from crappy flak missiles, which no one cared about. So, yeah. Then there's D-Eldar, not to be confused with Dark Eldar. So, D-Weapon Armed Eldar units. They are incredibly powerful. There was D-Scythe Wraiths, these were all introduced, or Wraith Guard, I should say. They were introduced in 6th edition, but hit the peak with the changes to D weapons in 7th edition, I feel. But an argument can be made for both editions. D weapons on the templates on the Wraith Guard, if you charge them, every guy got D3 hits on you. And the thing with the D weapons was you rolled a 1, it was a nothing, but if you rolled a 6, it was just the model was removed from play. Yeah, I think they had a slight negative to them because they were owning infantry carried ones, so it wasn't the removed from play, it was just you took like 6 wounds with no armor or invulnerable saves. So much better. Yeah. Then there was the AdMech War Convocation, which was, there was 2 Mechanicum Codex at the time. Scutari and I think just Adeptus Mechanicus, something like that. And what this did was allowed you to take a combination of the 2 together as a single army. It wasn't using an allied detachment, it was a formation. And it gave everything in that formation, which had a weird sort of mix of units, free war gear. So you just took the best anti-everything war gear that money could buy without paying the money for it. And there was obvious consequences to doing so. So yeah, that was some of the fun lists that were created. And as you can see, the further we went along, the more and more Death Stars in each edition started to appear. So this is my breakdown of the major changes that took 40k from 3rd edition through to the 8th edition timeline, the Great Reset. Because so few things happen in the first 14 years of the game, from 1998 3rd edition through to the end of 5th edition 2012, middle of 2012. Very few changes. Really the biggest 2 was the bulk power and special weapons and the USRs, and then tack on flyers is the 3rd biggest change. But going into 6th edition onwards, just look at how many major changes to the core rule system, not observations about who wrote codexes, but core changes to the core rules. Holy crap. And you wonder why things went out of control. Yeah, this Madman's flowchart that you're seeing before you is basically my timeline of all these huge changes that took place and just the insanity that occurred because of it. And this is really what killed 40k back in those times. And these are things that also concern me with other editions of the game, because I've seen this pattern, this cycle play out before. And so when I see similar sort of things happening in other systems, well, yeah. And, you know, they may not call them data slates, they may not call them formations, but think of things like stratagems and command points farming that happened in 8th edition. And then think about how 9th edition took those pure army bonuses and said, well, if you're taking an army that's all of one faction and you're sticking to a theme, quote unquote, have all these bonuses. And then they just got worse and worse and worse, where it was just insane bonuses for taking these quote unquote thematic armies. I feel like we're almost at the point with the game where instead of giving you any customization, because they've made it such a cluster of a game, 10th edition 40k seems to be just repeating many of the same flaws. I can't say it's a bad edition. It hasn't, you know, we haven't played it yet in as intended, right? We're in index level. We haven't even got codexes yet, but I see all the warning signs with 10th that we saw with these previous editions. And I'm thinking it's almost a point where, with 10th and the way that they've done points, just write the armies for the players, Games Workshop. Just write the armies, say, this is what you can take. This is your Space Marine army. This is your, you know, you've removed so much of the customization from the game. Why bother letting people put together their own list now? Just make everything essentially formations that you slap together to create an army. That way you'll limit the amount of, you know, captains they can take in one force, or lieutenants they can take in one force. So I'm looking at all lieutenant, all captain armies, for example, or limit the amount of mortal wounds that can be generated. Like, just create the list for the players. They probably won't mind too much if you make, like, you know, demi lists, we'll call them, that are just a mixture of small formations that be combined in different ways. That'd probably be more balanced than currently, where it's just take whatever units you like, don't worry about the points cost in War Gear, it'll all work it out in the end, because it doesn't. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it. That's Mac with the Outer Circle. I hope you found this an interesting Madman's flowchart of the divergence points of the game and the things that were added into the core mainline game and the effects that it had on basically the outcome of everything. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.